Professor Audrey Truschke, it's such a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for speaking to Frontline. Um, for viewers who don't know Professor Audrey Truschke, she's a historian. She teaches at Rutgers. She's written four books, one of which is the best-selling biography of Aurangzeb. Uh, she's recently come out with India, 5,000 years of history on the subcontinent. It's a tome, but it's such an enjoyable one. I have many questions to ask you about your work and about this book. So I'll start by saying that, when Princeton University Press first asked you to write a big book about South Asian history, you said no. What factors led you to finally saying yes?
So I said no for the obvious reasons. It's too big of a subject. I mean, this is 5,000 years of history for a quarter of the world's population. That's like a section of the library, not one book. I said yes for two reasons. One is, and I credit my editor, Priya Nelson at Princeton University Press, with both reasons. She's very persuasive. One is, she said, "Look, don't you need something to teach?" And that is true. I teach an overview of South Asian history over 2 semesters every year. We cover from the Indus Valley Civilization until the present year. I literally end with, headlines from that week in class. We need something to teach. I'm not defending how we approach South Asian studies in the United States, but within the confines of that system, I felt like a new book was needed. The second reason is, as my editor, Priya, pointed out, she said it's easier to convince men than women to take on big projects like this, and they were looking to diversify their authorship. And so then it became a question to me, do I have something to contribute that I think perhaps some of my male colleagues may not have the same perspective or set of perspectives on? And I think I do. And I think that comes through in the book in my inclusion of more diverse voices.
Looking at 5,000 years of South Asian history, did you ever run the risk of writing something that only touches upon aspects of the past you would otherwise interrogate more fully? Also, how did you ensure that your overview remains comprehensive?
So I think, yes, not only ran the risk of that, but that's a near certainty, is sort of skimming over a lot of stuff. Number one, and number two, it is not comprehensive. It is not possible to be comprehensive for all of South Asian history in a single volume. What I did choose to do was to be relatively representative, which is a little bit different. So I include a bit of most kinds of history in the book. I do macro history, I do micro history, I do economics, I do politics, society, religious history, cultural history. I look at texts, I look at archaeology, I look at genetic evidence, I look at material evidence. I've tried to bring
You
in
look at
all of this to
jewelry.
give I look at jewelry. Jewelry matters, right? What people wear. Most people listening to this interview are probably wearing a piece of metal somewhere on their body, right? Like this stuff does matter. It tells us things about people. I'm wearing a wedding band. That has cultural significance, right? Um, I talk about all of this. This is not going to tell you everything about South Asian history, but it's going to give you a taste. And the goal of a book like mine is ultimately to whet the reader's appetite, not to sate it. The goal is that this is not the last book anyone ever reads about the South Asian past.
In your book, India sometimes refers to the entire subcontinent. Were you ever worried that this might play into the hands of Hindu nationalists who dream of an Akhand Bharat, an India that subsumes nations like Pakistan, Nepal, and Afghanistan?
It's a good question. No, not really. One, not to put too fine of a point on it, but Hindu nationalists aren't known for their great reading skills. I honestly doubt that most will ever bother to read my book, this particular book especially. So that's one thing. The other is, the idea of India as a subcontinent, it's specifically a not political concept, right? The Indian nation state is very new in history, right? It's less than a century old. And so when I use India throughout the vast majority of the book, I am referring to a geographical entity. It's not a culturally unified area and it is not a politically unified area either. If some Hindu nationalist comes along and actually reads the book and manages to twist this into undivided India in their sort of narrow political conception, I suppose I'm not super worried about that. I think that the power behind that idea is not twisting academic arguments, it's the use of force and violence.
Oftentimes you tell the story of South Asia through the eyes of the disadvantaged, women, the poor, Dalits. Several historians have neglected these groups. How hard was it to write a story, to write a history from the point of view of people who were barely recorded, whose voices were barely recorded?
It definitely takes dedication to do that. When we look at the historical record, especially the written record, but to a great degree the material record, the archaeological record as well, what jumps out are the lives of elites. Those were the people with the money, with the resources. They're the ones with the nice houses, who bought the nice things, who used nice spices on their food, who had lovely jewelry, right? All of these things. And they're the ones who learned how to read and to write as well. And so those are the stories that are easiest to tell. That said, and I say this in the book at some point, I think it is incumbent upon historians to not just do the easiest thing, to not just use the same text over and over and tell the most obvious stories, but rather to do a couple of corrective measures. One is to seek out lesser told stories, right? Women did write texts in Sanskrit and Pali and other languages in pre-modern India. We just don't talk about them as much. Another thing we can do is to read texts against the grain. So I use a source like Manu Smriti, right? The Manava Dharma Shastra is its formal title, right? Manu's Code of Laws. This is a Brahmanical male-authored Sanskrit work that's about caste-based oppression. You can read it through a straightforward Brahmanical lens, and I do some of that. I do talk about Manu's ideas, but I also invert them and talk about what that looks like or may have looked like from the bottom, right? So reading against the grain can be a great tool in our toolkit.
You write that you strive to listen to the whisperings of history, to read against the grain, like you said, of well-used sources and to seek out hitherto neglected ones. I wanted to ask that while researching this book, were you ever taken by surprise? And where do you break new ground?
I am perpetually taken by surprise by what I find in South Asian history. I change my views with some regularity in accordance with the evidence, like any good historian does. Um, I was particularly surprised. Some of the early history of Buddhism, that's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I've spent some time thinking about the end of Buddhism on the subcontinent, but not its early beginning. I was not quite aware of the extent of our evidence for female involvement and women-led patronage of early Buddhist sites and Buddhist nuns. That was one thing. Another I'll name because folks might be interested, given that I'm most well known probably as a Mughal historian. I actually rethought one of my views on the Mughals. There's a story that Shah Jahan, built the Taj Mahal for his wife. That's all true, and that it was a true love. Right? If you go to the Taj Mahal, any tour guide will tell you that. I'd always discounted that as sort of a fairy tale. Right? The Mughals married for political alliances, not for love. And upon reviewing all the sources, I actually came to the conclusion that it's more likely than not that that actually was a true and genuine love between the two of them. So there's always new stones to be unturned.
You say that you're not immune to the pull of the present. I wanted to ask, how did you avoid the pitfalls that come with looking at the past through glasses that are tinted with the hue of present day biases? That's one. And also, if this is a trend, how dangerous is it?
So I think, when I say I'm not immune from the pull of the present, right? One sort of way that comes out in the book is that I do cover shorter time periods as we move forward. So the first chapter covers 700 years. The last chapter covers, I think, 30 or 40. That said, I did not want to reinterpret the past through the lens of the present. And so I think the main thing that consists of is being hyper vigilant about what our concerns and obsessions are today and making sure that we do not overemphasize that. So to give a concrete example of this, anyone who follows India and Indian politics today thinks about Hindu nationalism quite a lot. It's a big, big deal, big story, big trend in society. I cover Hindu nationalism. I cover its founding as an ideology and in an acted and lived reality about a century ago. I talk about it in modern politics. I talk about Modi and the BJP. I cover all the essentials. But I also don't end the book with that, right? The end of India is not the current day of Hindu nationalism. I end the book with climate change, which I have no doubt will outlive Hindutva in terms of its influence in Indian life and politics. It can be really hard to provincialize our present right? You know, and to just take a step back and to realize that the concerns that animate us and even the trends that shape our lives in powerful and sometimes painful ways may not ultimately be all that critical in the longue durée of South Asian history.
I have several questions based on just what you told me, but I'll come to those later. But one more general question before I get into the book. How important is it for historians to be empathetic? Does this empathy manifest only in accuracy, or did your empathy force you to look harder for facts that are redemptive?
I don't know about redemptive. I don't know if I'd use that word, but I have become, especially through writing this particular book, a strong believer in empathy and not just an accuracy empathy, but a true empathy. I think this comes from, for me, in part, just an emphasis on the reality of history, right? Like, this is not a fairy tale. This is not a set of novels or short stories, right? Like, we are talking about real people who actually lived, who experienced pain, who experienced joy and happiness and sadness, and did certain things in the world and had things done to them. And in that sort of very baseline fundamental sense, they are like us. And I want people, to the degree possible, to understand that, right? And not just understand it intellectually, but to actually feel it in some meaningful way, right? Because can you really understand the life of someone if you don't make at least some good faith attempt to try to understand what they lived through? So to me,
Right.
that's really critical to sort of cognizing history and part of its importance. I'm not saying empathy is the whole game, but I think it's part of it.
Getting into the chapters of your book, I start with the Indus Valley civilization. You dispel several myths about it, but so much is said about the sanitation in Indus cities. But you show how those systems had always hinged on manual scavenging. Was iniquity written into Indian societies from the very start?
Yes, but that wasn't unusual, right? I mean, show me a society without a social hierarchy, right? I mean, that's a fantasy. It doesn't exist in my experience. Um, I certainly don't think that we can, sometimes people talk about, can we see something like the caste system going all the way back to the Indus civilization? The answer to that is we have no evidence either way. So no, we can't pontificate about that. That said, I mean, I thought the manual scavenging point, that was something that just really, stuck out to me. So many people have written about how the Indus civilizations, the rich people, not everyone, but the wealthy in the cities, how, they had two-story houses and they had indoor bathrooms. But then you look at the sketch plans, you look at the excavation reports, and it's like some of these bathrooms had drains going to the street, but some of them didn't. And for those who didn't, what do you think happened, right? Like, obviously, there's a manual scavenging situation of some sort going on there. And so this is what I mean by reading against the grain. You can look at that archaeological evidence and you can imagine yourself as the rich person who inhabited the house, or you can imagine yourself as the guy who's cleaning the bathroom. And I think we should do both.
Certain Vedic rituals are explicitly sexual. The finale of the Ashwamedha, for instance, involves the sacrificer's wife pantomiming sex with a dead horse. Could you maybe summarize for us the attitudes towards sex and sexuality in ancient Vedic cultures?
So, whoever you are and whatever you think about sex, it was different than the Vedic peoples thought about it. Okay, that's your starting baseline. Okay, the Vedic peoples had a very, honestly, historically speaking, unusual approach to sex and sexuality in many ways, especially in the religious realm. All right. Um, Many of the kind of more prudish aspects of both Indian and American societies that exist today, that wasn't there back then. Right. So, to the extent that you are uncomfortable with thinking about a Vedic sacrifice ending with the sacrificer's wife pantomiming having sex with an erect, just strangled horse, right? Most people are probably pretty uncomfortable with that sentence that I just said. You need to bracket that as your problem in 2025. Okay, that's going to block you, if you get into it, from understanding what the Vedic peoples were trying to do. Now, the Vedic peoples, this was not like a free for all, like free love, let's all just sleep with everyone sort of thing. No, 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 no. Sexuality was relatively controlled, which helps to explain why, in a ritual context, there was this unleashing of chaos concerning sexuality. It was a controlled chaos that was held into check by the ritual itself and by its own rules. If you're wondering why sex, Like why the emphasis on sex? Why can't they just like light some candles or something like that, right? I mean, there was also fire. There's also a lot of fire involved. Um, but they viewed sex as kind of is a procreative thing, right? Which is, biologically correct and also culturally relatively consistent. That's a view that lives on in later iterations of Hinduism as well. And so it was something to be, I don't know if celebrated is the right word, but definitely sort of harnessed and incorporated into rituals, including animal sacrifice. And those kinds of rituals were the most important within Vedic society.
The Buddha, we are led to believe, rebutted several Vedic practices, but you point out that none of the monarchies or oligarchies from his time embraced Vedic cultures. Is the Buddhist opposition to Vedic ritual more myth than fact?
We can't say for sure. So there is a narrative attraction for sure to seeing the Gautama Buddha as coming along and rejecting all this Vedic stuff. Certainly he wasn't into it, right? He didn't want to use Sanskrit because that was a Vedic Brahmin thing. He wanted to use Pali, right? Um, I, but the question is really, was he consciously rejecting the Vedas? And in order, in a Vedic way of life, and for him to have done that, that would signal to us today that Vedic culture and society had expanded enough and had been adopted by enough people in northern India that it was prominent enough to reject, right? You don't reject what like, your teenage neighbor's son is doing next door and nobody else thinks about or cares about, right? Like you reject major trends, generally speaking, in your society that are threatening to you or you perceive as threatening in some way. And frankly, there's not evidence for that, right? That the Buddha was consciously trying to say, this Vedic stuff is wrong. You should do my stuff instead. It seems more likely to me, based on the evidence, that he was just like, look, I don't know, those people over there doing whatever. This is my way, right? And that's a slightly different formulation.
In one rock inscription, the Emperor Ashoka says that he has the power to punish forest people with lethal force. What does this exception tell us about Ashoka's Dhamma? Seeing how it wasn't universal, should we reassess our appreciation of his nonviolence?
A great many historian has been smitten by Ashoka. I agree with essentially all of my colleagues that he had a unique voice and a unique approach to both ruling and religion in many ways. That said, I think some of my colleagues have gone a little bit far in sort of eating up his propaganda, right? I mean, Ashoka's known for his nonviolence, we often say. Of course, that's after the Kalinga War massacre. It's pretty easy to adopt nonviolence after you're done with your conquering and your killing. Um, but then also, his nonviolence is never absolute, right? And he threatens not everyone, but the most vulnerable people in his society and those who rejected his way of life. Among other things, Ashoka was actively leading and participating in an urbanization of northern India that proceeded slowly, but probably quicker under him due to the sort of coalescence of resources than it did at subsequent points in time. And the forest people seem to have wanted nothing to do with that. And Ashoka did not take the attitude of let's live and let live. It was sort of my way or the highway, right? There are no heroes really in history. And I think that that can be a hard thing. People want heroes. We intrinsically want that. I accept that as a human desire. But as a historian, my job is not to give you heroes or to make you feel better. My job is to present human beings as they were with all of their flaws.
There are no heroes, but you write about it toward the end of your book. You also say that historians are sometimes killjoys. This sort of reminds me of that statement.
Absolutely. Well, people come in with all these like, fantastic semi-mythical ideas about the past and it all like comes together and they have this whole storyline and then the historian sort of in the corner being like, no, no, definitely not. Probably not, right? It's not the best aspect of the job, but like, be mad at the truth, don't be mad at the messenger.
The Mahabharata, you write, projects an unabashedly upper caste outlook. The Ramayana too has inbuilt tools for othering one's enemies. When reading these epics today, how important is it to separate their stories from their politics?
I think that entirely depends on what you want to do with the stories, right? Both epics, they cross over every boundary we have. Their literature, their history, their politics, their cultural advice, their religious text, they're not religious text. You can do a ton of stuff with the epics, right? If you are somebody who is a practicing devout Hindu and you're reading the Bhagavad Gita for spiritual advice on how to live now, I want to think about trying to sort out some of the upper caste stuff. That would be my personal inclination if I were going to do that, right? And to sort of take a different approach to that text. And people have read the Gita in every which way you can possibly imagine, right? I actually return to that particular text, the Bhagavad Gita, throughout the book in terms of how people reinterpret it. Um, that said, if you're like me, if you're a historian and you're reading the Ramayana as part of the intellectual output of pre-modern India and for its intellectual history of ideas, well, then obviously we don't want to dispense with the upper caste point of view. We want to forefront that because that's critical to what the text is and what it tells us about.
You were talking about Manu earlier, but Manu's disdain for Shudras and women still persists in forms of discrimination um, that are very prevalent and exist in society today. Do you think that Indians can or will one day erase his legacy?
I do not think that Manu is responsible for prejudice in modern day India. I think
Okay.
modern day Indians who exhibit those prejudices are responsible for those prejudices, right? You don't get to cite an old Sanskrit guy who wrote almost 2,000 years ago and be like, oh, it's his fault, not mine. No, it's your fault, right? Um, will India ever move beyond its modern day prejudices? Absolutely. Assuming that, our world doesn't come to a screeching halt, which I certainly hope it doesn't. I absolutely think Indians will. Will our world ever move beyond prejudice? That I don't know. But it's changing all the time, right? And I do think one myth that we all live with is that the prejudices of whether it's India or Europe or America, that these have somehow been the same for a long time, right? And that's not true. They're actually morphing and changing all the time.
In his latest book, The Golden Road, William Dalrymple describes India, I quote, as one of the main motors of global trade and cultural transmission in early world history. Having looked at this period yourself, do you agree with his assessment?
I do not agree with everything William Dalrymple has written in that book and others, but I do agree with that assessment. India had a whole lot of stuff that other people wanted. I mean, the word India was synonymous with wealth in many ways for many people in pre-modernity because India had textiles and wood and spices and precious gems and diamond mines. And people wanted that stuff, right? And so they traded with India to get it.
What about the Golden Road do you not agree with?
Oh, I think it's a bit celebratory at times. I think it overemphasizes certain aspects of Buddhism. I'll leave it at that.
Right, okay. Initially, the word Hindu was used in a geographical or cultural sense, similar to how many use Indian today. Can you tell us a bit about how the word traveled the course of time to eventually denote a broad-based religious community?
I think it's pretty clear, right? Hindu, Indian, India, right? Like these are all related terms etymologically, right? That's why you have the IND in all of them. Um, and the word Hindu, it's not an indigenous term. It doesn't, it's not a Sanskrit term. It doesn't come from, any known Indian language. It's a Perso-Arabic term. So it sort of comes from Al-Hind in Arabic and then comes to be Hindi and Hindu. Both are used in Persian. And for a long time, it basically means Indian, right? And it's actually very confusing. People mess this up all the time when they look back at old documents. They're like, oh, look, they're talking about Hindus. This is a religious category. And it's not. It actually just means Indian. Um, Hindu was used as recently as 1940 on the US Census to mean Indian in a racial sense, right? So this is not some like archaic usage. It's one that persisted into our times, broadly speaking. Um, but long story short, in pre-modernity, people we would now call Hindu anachronistically seem to have felt no pressure, as far as I can discern or anyone else can discern, to come up with a category, an overarching name for all of them, right? So it's not like there was some other word. It's not like Hindus used to be called X and then we replaced it, right? There is no Sanskrit or Sanskrit-based term for Hindus or Hinduism. People rather identified by a myriad of other identities. They would say, I'm a Shaiva, I'm a Vaishnava, I worship the goddess. I'm from North India, I'm from South India, I'm from Karnataka. Some would use caste identities. I'm Vaishya, I'm Brahmin, right? I'm Tamil Brahmin, that sort of thing. And it's hard to know for a historian what to make of an absence. Like, what do we make of the absence of an overarching term? But at least I feel comfortable saying these folks did not prioritize conceptualizing themselves as all belonging to the same tradition. And that kind of makes sense because in a pre-modern world, India didn't have a census. Nobody knew population numbers. Certainly, people knew that there were a lot of people around who worshipped a lot of different deities and did different religious stuff. But do Shaivites really consider themselves part of the same religion as Vaishnavites? Right? There are Shaivite groups today who would actually say we're not the same religion as those folks, right? Like the Ligayats come to mind in southern India here. And so it's really it's a product of modernity that the Hindu community wanted to create that, to conceptualize themselves as the Hindu community, right? And it comes about through the British and through the census and through this emphasis on broad-based religious identities that is absent in earlier South Asian history. This is part of what I mean about how it's so hard to disentangle our present day views. Because in 2025, I think to tell anyone with even a passing knowledge of Indian society and politics today, to tell them, look, religious identity wasn't that big of an issue, like several hundred years ago, it's sort of like, what are you talking about? Like religious-based identity is the issue today for many people. It's a huge issue, whether you want it to be or not. And yet, this is part of the point of studying history, is to understand that our societies change often radically over time, and to try to imagine a past where it was really different, where you would not have identified as a Hindu, or that word would have made no sense to you and your ancestors, because that's how it used to be.
Rajputs accepted Akbar as a Muslim Rajput, while Sanskrit poets cast the Mughal emperor as Vishnu on earth. I wanted to ask how much of Akbar's purported syncretism was genuine and how much of it was just state sponsored propaganda.
I don't care. And here's what I mean by that. So personally, I have zero interest in what was in Akbar's like heart of hearts. Like, what did he really believe? Like, what do I care? This guy who died in 1605, right? Like, he's one person among billions in history. I do not fundamentally care what he actually thought or believed. So I don't care if it was genuine. The reason why I care about Akbar is that he was a particularly important and influential man in pre-modern India. And so his policies affected millions of Indians. That's why we care about Akbar. Not because of him. He's just one random dude. Okay? We care about him because of his impact on a whole lot of people. And for those purposes, who cares if it was genuine or not? That's not the issue, right? What matters is what he actually enacted in terms of Mughal state policy and how that changed the outlooks and views and resources of different groups and communities.
You say that Aurangzeb had no policy towards Hindus at large, and that in his time, the percentage of Hindus in the Mughal imperial authority surged by 50%. His critics, however, choose to focus on the dozen odd Hindu and Jain temples he damaged or destroyed. Uh, Based on the extensive work that you've done on Aurangzeb, I wanted to ask how inaccurate are portraits that paint him as bigoted and anti Hindu?
I would say they're entirely inaccurate. The the idea that Aurangzeb was bigoted and anti-Hindu, this is a modern issue. It's designed for a modern audience. I mean, how are you supposed to be anti-Hindu in a world where Hindu is not a major operative religious category? That makes absolutely no sense. These views, they also violate one of the most cherished principles of historians, which is why you see no legitimate historians making that argument. And that principle is you do not cherry pick, right? So as you point out in your question, I talk about Aurangzeb's policies and incorporate more Hindus, whereas his critics only focus on his temple destructions. But what you don't point out is that I also talk about his temple destructions because historians, real legitimate historians, don't cherry pick. We talk about it all. And we have to come up with theories that make sense at the time and that explain the variety of Aurangzeb's actions, right? He targeted temples for political reasons. There is scholarly consensus on that point, and there has been for a few decades now. And that theory, it helps us to explain why he targeted some temples and left the vast majority of them untouched. It also allows us to explain why he has many imperial orders protecting certain temples. If he's just an anti-Hindu bigot, well, that doesn't make sense, right? That doesn't actually add up with the available historical evidence. For those who are upset by this, because every time I talk about Aurangzeb, people start screaming at me, all right? I ask you to consider whether your argument really has to do with history. Because that's what I'm talking about. I actually want to understand and know what this guy who impacted the lives of tens of millions of Indians did back in the 16th, sorry, the 17th into the early 18th centuries. Whereas I think many folks who yell back at me, they don't really care about Aurangzeb, who's been dead for over 3 centuries. What they care is having somebody now to use in political contexts. That's a different conversation.
The other thing about temple destruction is that, according to your book, the Aurangzeb was not the only Indian king who was destroying temples, right?
Oh no, not at all. I mean, the Mughals come in very late to that game. I don't know, people talk about them because of British colonial propaganda. That's in a later issue. But yeah, I mean, the Mughals come in, close to a millennium into the temple desecration and destruction game. This is an idea, especially the desecration part, that is invented by Hindu kings, who we now anachronistically call them Hindu kings, who were attacking each other, right? Muslim rulers come in later and they sort of see this and they're like, yeah, we could work with that.
But but just sticking to Aurangzeb, I just had another question, which was about Gyanvapi in Benares, for instance. You talk about the Taj Mahal and the controversies that have come to surround the Taj Mahal of late, that it could perhaps be a Shiva temple. The Gyanvapi Mosque is spoken about as a Shiva temple by certain nationalists and people in Benares. Um, how dangerous do you think it is to bring the past into the present, or a certain view of the past into the present, uh, and say that, I mean, architecture should be changed in accordance to that view?
I think it's incredibly dangerous. And I would cite as evidence for that the most prominent example, which is the 1992 destruction of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. On that day, all Indians lost a piece of priceless heritage. There are relatively few Babur period mosques. That said, the greater loss are the thousands of Muslims who were killed in the years leading up in 1992 and in subsequent cases of violence as well. And yeah, there's a new temple there now. And I mean, it's a tragedy that political monument exists and that it is not respectful of the Muslim lives who were lost, right? You look at something like the Gyanvapi Masjid, it is built on the site. So I will say, so transitioning here, the Babri Masjid was not built on the site of a former temple, so far as the evidence suggests. So that's an invented story. The Gyanvapi Mosque is different. That's clearly built on the site of a former temple. The evidence at the time suggests that, and the temple wall is like there as part of the mosque, right? That's actually very clear. A lot of stuff happened in pre-modernity. And look, as somebody who lives much of the time in my head in the Indian past, right? Like I'm more in my headspace in history than possibly any, like most other people on this planet. I don't want to live there, right? I can explain to you why Aurangzeb wanted to destroy that mosque, why he did order that mosque destroyed. I can explain to you the political reasons. I don't want to live in his empire. I'm pretty attached to like the 21st century and rule of law and respecting religious places. Appreciating and empathizing with the past does not mean that we want to recreate it in our present. And so that's something that I think that those who are calling for the destruction of that mosque should consider, is that they're basically saying we want to act like a 17th century king that we consider to be a brute. Like, is that really what you want in the 21st century? That's really how you honor your religion? As a footnote, I would note one interesting thing is that the Vishvanatha, or the Vishveshvara, goes by both names, temple that used to stand there that was destroyed. That temple's actually been rebuilt. It's like down the street, right? That
Yeah,
was rebuilt in the
yeah.
18th century. So, like, how many times are we going to rebuild that thing? I don't know. Anyways, just food for thought.
Unlike the British, who contributed to dozens of famines during 2 centuries of colonial rule, the Mughals tried to alleviate distress by buying grain and giving loans. Does this in any way prove that the Mughals saw themselves more as Indian and not as foreigners?
Oh, most definitely. I think The question, did the Mughals see themselves more as Indian than as foreigners? It's a false binary. They saw themselves as both. They wouldn't have used the word foreigner. That would have Persian equivalents would have rung a bit negative to them, but they saw themselves as descendants of Timur and who we call Tamerlane sometimes in English. They saw themselves as descendants of Genghis Khan, and they also saw themselves as Indian rulers. This is not a zero-sum game. You're not like a third of each or something. You're not half foreign, half Indian, right? They're like fully all of these things. Um, the Mughals also, and why I bring up that example in the book, they saw their relationship to the people they ruled, to their subjects, very differently than British colonialists did. So for the Mughals, right, it's not, I mean, they weren't like, I don't know, like bleeding heart, like let's like help everyone sorts, right? Like, I mean, they were kings who were holding power through force and control, like every other pre-modern king before them. That said, they did have somewhat of a paternalistic relationship in their minds with the people they ruled. And so when a famine hits, generally speaking, they wanted to help alleviate suffering. Not to the extent of like collapsing their empire or using up all their resources, but to what they considered a reasonable extent. That is different than how the British saw things, right? For the British, they're working in a colonialist model where they never want to become Indian. That's not even on the table. That would be an insulting thing. What the British want is to strip India, the colony, of resources to benefit Britain, the metropole back at home. They felt no obligation, especially under the East India Company and early on, to the people that they're ruling. It was a much more purely exploitative relationship.
Indian kings, you write, sometimes use religious rhetoric to express political conflict, but it rarely, if ever, guided state policy. Would it be fair for us to assume that it was India's colonizers who first made Indian governments intolerant and prejudiced?
No, I don't think that would be fair. So what I tell my students when I teach is if you want to know if you like a pre-modern Indian king, like if you would have thought they were a good person, you want to sit and have a beer with them, you would get along with them, you would think they're tolerant, right? Like you just stop at pre-modern. You don't need the name, you don't need the era, you don't need the dynasty. I guarantee you don't like this person, right? Pre-modernity was really, really different. And from a modern perspective, all pre-modern Indian kings were intolerant, but that is an impoverished way to look at history. Because the point of studying the past is not to think about whether we like it, whether we think that these people were tolerant, were they good, were they prejudiced? I mean, everybody's prejudiced in some way. The goal is to understand the details and how their society worked and what they did that changed things that ultimately, in some sense, lead to what we experience now, right? Um, that said, I do think the British introduced new forms of intolerance and new forms of prejudice that did not exist. And even on a more of like a meta level than that, they introduced new kind of terms of identity that were hard and exclusive in many ways. And that had not been the case in much of Indian society before.
Um, do Hindu nationalists inherit their Islamophobia from the British, or does their hatred have a different flavor, like an exaggerated virulence, perhaps?
Oh no, they get that from the British too. Yeah, it's ironic because Hindu nationalists, I mean, they're so hot and heavy in recent years on this like anti-colonial thing, but they are the intellectual inheritors of British colonial thought. And Hindu nationalists, those who know their own history, know that. They know that they sat out the independence struggle. They know that the RSS didn't want its people participating. I mean, an RSS man assassinated the major leader of the Indian independence movement in 48 when Godse kills Gandhi. Um, but I think, I mean, the there's the history and then there's sort of what we do about it today. So the history and the genealogy of these ideas is yes, it's the British who first articulate the kind of exaggerated big bad Muslim emperors that treated all these Hindus poorly. The British come up with that stuff, but Indians are there. They're there from the beginning. They're helping the British, and many of them start writing almost immediately especially in vernacular languages, sharing these same kinds of images, right? So it's not like the British are saying this for 150 years and then in independence, suddenly Indians start saying it too, right? There is Indian involvement in creating these characters from the beginning. In any case, in 2025, the British are pretty long gone from South Asia. And so if you're thinking about sort of where the moral responsibility for sharing disinformation about and villainizing religious minorities and other minority communities in India, where that responsibility lays today, it's within the subcontinent. It's not outside of it.
You mentioned Godse. I wanted to ask that after Nathuram Godse murdered Gandhi, Indians, you say, overwhelmingly chose Gandhi's pluralistic values over Hindu nationalist violence. Has that position changed irreversibly? Do Gandhian values have any chance of making a comeback?
Nothing is irreversible in the course of history. That said, whatever, there's also no turning back to the past, right? Will some form of Gandhian values reemerge? I don't know. What I do know is we will move on from this current moment. If some form of Gandhi's values of nonviolence and inclusion come back, it will be in a different form because that's all it can be. You can never sort of turn back the clock. The reason why I did sort of try to hammer that point home in the book, though, that Indians overwhelmingly said we want nothing to do with Hindutva. This is a hateful, horrible ideology, like no respectable Indian would touch it. I try to hammer that point home based honestly on my experience of teaching, right? As an undergraduate teacher, I hang out with a lot of like 18 to 22-year-olds a lot of the time. I get a lot of students who have done part or all of their education through high school in India. And many of them, even members of the Indian American diaspora, they don't know that world. They have no memory of it, right? All they know is a world where Hindu nationalism is the defining political ideology. And so to me, it's important to remind them how new that is, right? And that their parents experienced a different world. And for the vast majority of them, their grandparents actually chose something very different.
The question is hypothetical, but what would Indian history have looked like if Mohandas Gandhi had not opposed the 1932 Communal Award, a law that gave the caste-oppressed separate electorates, one that B.R. Ambedkar had urged the British to pass?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'm generally not a big historian for sort of theoreticals and what might have happened. I suppose I would like to think that that would have led us to be further along the path towards caste equity. We're not nearly as far along that path as many of us would hope in 2025. So I'd hope we'd be further along with that today, but who knows?
The Hindu far right often whitewashes its violent history. But like Godra, they also want us to forget, as you point out in the book, how the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha killed almost 30,000 Muslims in Rajasthan during partition. Do you look at your work as an antidote to this amnesia?
I mean, I think that's possibly overselling it. I don't know that one person can be the antidote to this amnesia. But I mean, fundamentally, the historian's charge is not to forget, right? I mean, that's what we do is we remember and we remind other people, sort of whether they want to be reminded or not, of what happened, right? There does come no point where we won't talk about it anymore, or it's done, or it's over, right? That's not how historians work and think. Um, I think there are obvious reasons why the RSS doesn't want to talk about their violent history today. And it's because they're still violent, right? Like that hasn't changed. The fundamental structure and nature of the RSS has actually been relatively consistent over the last 100 years. And that's a danger today. And people should know that, right? And part of how we assess how dangerous certain groups are and whether we want them within our society is by knowing what they've done in the past, because it shows what they're capable of now.
You write about how Bollywood has changed, how Jodha Akbar in 2008 celebrated the Mughals, and how Padmavat invokes Islamophobic stereotypes. Do you watch many Hindi films? Do you think they're a fair estimate of the national pulse?
I watch a certain amount of Bollywood cinema. I think that's not that unusual. I do caution people, Jodha Akbar is not history. Okay, like watch it, enjoy it. It's entertainment, right? But that's not actually history. Um, but yes, as a flavor of the nationalist pulse, I absolutely think that's a fair. I think it's a prudent and sensible use of this bit of popular culture for a historian, right? I get other people, you just want to watch Bollywood and, escape and Shah Rukh Khan's, face, what, like, you do you, right? But for me, that's sort of what I'm interested in, is seeing what it reflects of Indian society. And when we think about, big Bollywood blockbuster films that, millions and millions of people see and some people watch over and over, we're seeing them as both like reflective of society and changes they're in, and then also sort of prescriptive and kind of as like as part of the machinery that is creating certain views and entrenching certain ideas, right? And, we used to see a bit more of tolerance and difference, and we all get along and we worship different gods, but it's okay. And we see a little bit less of that now, really quite a bit less.
You predict you were talking about this earlier, but I wanted to ask you this question that you predict that by the late 21st century, parts of South Asia may become too hot for human survival. Which is the mightier foe, religious fundamentalism or climate change?
Well, I think they're probably going to go together, right? One thing about fundamentalist ideologies, whether they're religious or otherwise, is they don't tend to be super attached to reality and the truth, right? They tend to be denialist about real challenges. And that is something I also talk about in the book. I mean, the Indian government has not been very forthcoming on climate change data and things like that, right? They're more interested in keeping up the rosy picture rather than actually preparing India and Indian society and citizens for success in the future. Um, so I don't think we're going to have to choose between our downfalls on that front. That said, I am fairly certain, and just based on the data, that climate change will still be an issue in, say, 80 years. Right? Let's say 75 years, 2100. I think climate change will be a major issue still in South Asian society. I don't know that Hindu nationalism will. Right? That would not surprise me if it were more short-lived. We'll see.
In 2021, the Hindu American Foundation filed a lawsuit against you for defamation. You've also received death threats in the past. How do you find the courage to persevere in the face of such harassment?
Part of it's probably not, but natural personality instincts. I've never appreciated bullies. I've never liked running from a fight, right? I've never been one to back down. Um, but I mean, I suppose I don't know if it's courage or hubris. I'd like to think it's courage, but I'm pretty convinced that I'm in the right? And that's not to say that I am always correct. Nobody is always correct in their views. But my views as a historian, and I have always been attacked in that capacity, right? For my views as a historian and my commentaries on modern Indian politics and society, which is based on my historian's training. All of that, it's based on evidence. It's based on analytical thought. It's based on my analysis of the facts available. When the facts available change, if that changes my view, I change my view, and I have changed my views and nuanced my views in many ways over the years. And so I am convinced that I'm on the side of right here. And I suppose I'm also pretty invested in maintaining this because I want to live in a world of evidence. I want to live in a world where we can all speak our minds. I want to live in a world of religious freedom. I'm pretty committed to doing my small part in trying to normalize and ensure that world.
My last question to you is that given the antipathy the Hindu right feels toward you, you said it would be unadvisable for you to visit India now. Do you see the circumstance change in your lifetime?
I certainly hope so. I intend on living a long life. I'm only in my early 40s, right? So we've got some decades yet. I very much look forward to returning to India someday. Not being able to safely travel to India at present it's one of the great sadnesses of my life, and I do not expect anybody else to feel sad about that. Like I'm just one American citizen, I can't go where I want to go. I understand if no one sees that as a tragedy, and I'm not asking you to. But for me personally, it has been a significant loss. I wish India as a nation all the best, and I look forward to it moving to a better place that welcomes historians, both of its among its own citizens and among the international community.
It's been such a pleasure speaking to you, Professor. Thank you so very much for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.